They say that some moments in life are so crushing they split your world into before and after. For me, that moment happened at what should have been one of the happiest occasions of my life. My future daughter-in-law's bridal shower. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 58 years old. For the past 4 years, I believed that my endless generosity and financial support for my son's relationship would eventually earn me the love and respect I craved. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment that shattered my heart wasn't when Sophia rolled her eyes at my gift suggestion, or when she barely acknowledged the thousands I'd spent on her engagement party. It was when she stood up at her bridal shower, champagne glass in one hand, microphone in the other, and announced to a room full of her closest friends and family, "Well, I guess we should thank Margaret for being here today. After all, she's only here because she paid for the food." The laughter that followed felt like daggers piercing through every sacrifice I'd made. Every sleepless night I'd worked overtime, every dream I'd deferred to make their fairy tale possible. The humiliation of that moment was so profound that I excused myself to the bathroom and cried until my mascara ran in black streams down my cheeks. But what I discovered in the months that followed made that public embarrassment seem like a gentle breeze compared to the hurricane of deception that was about to be revealed. What happened next didn't just change my relationship with my son and his fiancée. It changed everything about how I saw myself and what I deserved from the people I loved. I never imagined my story would unfold this way. Growing up in the Yaqui, small coastal town of Millbrook, California, I dreamed of having a large, close-knit family where Sunday dinners were sacred and holidays were filled with laughter and tradition. My parents, Thomas and Eleanor Hayes, ran a successful hardware store and taught me the value of hard work and putting family first. When I married my college sweetheart, David Thompson, at 24, we shared the same vision of building something beautiful together. David was everything I'd hoped for in a partner. He worked as a high school history teacher while I built my career as a real estate agent, and together we saved every penny for the home where we planned to raise our children. We bought a charming Victorian house on Elm Street with a wraparound porch and a backyard perfect for barbecues and birthday parties. The neighborhood was exactly what we wanted: tree-lined streets where kids could ride their bikes safely, and neighbors actually knew each other's names. We tried for children for 3 years before I finally became pregnant with our son, Ryan. From the moment I held him in my arms, I knew I would move mountains to give him the best life possible. David and I were those parents who never missed a school play, who drove hours for travel baseball tournaments, who stayed up all night helping with science projects. Ryan was our world, and we made sure he knew it. When Ryan was 12, our perfect life took an unexpected turn. David began experiencing severe headaches that doctors initially dismissed as stress. By the time they discovered the brain tumor, it had already progressed significantly. The next 2 years were a blur of treatments, hospital stays, and desperate hope. David fought with everything he had, but the cancer was relentless. He passed away just 2 weeks after Ryan's 14th birthday, leaving me to navigate single parenthood while drowning in medical debt and grief. The life insurance, barely key, covered the funeral expenses and remaining medical bills. Our savings had been depleted during David's illness, and I found myself working 16-hour days to keep our house and maintain some semblance of the life Ryan had known. I picked up weekend shifts, worked holidays, and took on the most challenging listings that other agents avoided. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, but somehow we managed to keep our heads above water. Ryan handled his father's death better than I expected, though I knew he was struggling internally. He threw himself into his studies and sports, earning a partial scholarship to UC San Diego for engineering. I was so proud of him, but even with the scholarship, college expenses were overwhelming. I took out loans, worked additional jobs, and, liquidated what little remained of our investments to cover his dormitory fees, textbooks, and living expenses. During Ryan's sophomore year, he met Sophia Martinez at a campus coffee shop where she worked part-time while studying marketing. When he brought her home for Thanksgiving that year, I was immediately struck by her beauty and confidence. Sophia had long, glossy black hair, perfectly manicured nails, and a smile that could light up a room. She was also clearly from a different world than ours. Her father, Carlos Martinez, owned a chain of upscale Mexican restaurants throughout Southern California, and her mother, Isabella, was a former beauty queen who now managed the family's real estate investments. They lived in a gated community in La Jolla, where the smallest homes cost more than I would earn in a decade. When Sophia walked through our modest Victorian house, I caught her taking photos with her phone, though she claimed she was just capturing the vintage charm. Ryan was completely smitten. He talked about Sophia constantly during our weekly phone calls, describing her ambitions, her intelligence, and her plans to launch her own event planning business after graduation. I was happy for him, though I couldn't shake the feeling that Sophia viewed our family as quaint at best and inadequate at worst. Still, I embraced her as warmly as I could, hoping that love would bridge whatever gaps existed between our backgrounds. After graduation, Ryan landed a good position with a tech startup in San Diego, while Sophia began working for a prestigious event planning company in the same city. They moved in together to a sleek apartment downtown that cost more per month than my mortgage payment. When I visited for the first time, I was amazed by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, the modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and the wine refrigerator that cost more than my car. Ryan seemed happy, but I noticed changes in him. He dressed differently now, favoring expensive brands I'd never heard of. He talked about restaurants and experiences that sounded impossibly glamorous. When I asked how they could afford such a lifestyle on their entry-level salaries, he became evasive, mentioning something about Sophia's family helping with certain expenses and his company offering generous bonuses. The first time Ryan asked me for money was 6 months after they'd moved in together. He called on a Thursday evening, his voice tight with stress. "Mom, I hate to ask, but we're in a bit of a bind. Sophia's car needs major repairs, and with rent and everything else, we're stretched pretty thin. Could you possibly lend us $3,000 just until my next bonus comes through?" I didn't hesitate. Ryan had never asked me for money before, and I assumed this was a genuine emergency. I withdrew the funds from my retirement account the next day and transferred them immediately. Ryan's relief was palpable when I called to confirm the transfer. "You're a lifesaver, Mom. I promise we'll pay you back as soon as possible." That promise echoed in my mind over the following months, as similar requests became a regular occurrence. Sophia's business venture needed startup capital. Their apartment lease required a larger security deposit when they renewed. Ryan's company delayed bonus payments due to economic uncertainty. Each request came with detailed explanations and heartfelt promises of repayment, and each time I found myself saying yes. The requests gradually increased in size and frequency. $5,000 for Sophia's business equipment, $8,000 for a deposit on a better apartment in a trendier neighborhood, $12,000 for Ryan's MBA program, which would supposedly guarantee his promotion. With each transfer, my retirement savings dwindled while their lifestyle became increasingly extravagant. I began working with more demanding clients, taking on properties in distant cities that required extensive travel, and sacrificing my weekends to show homes to difficult buyers. My health started to suffer from the stress and exhaustion, but I convinced myself that this was temporary. Once Ryan's career took off and Sophia's business became profitable, they would be able to support themselves and perhaps even help me in my later years. Meanwhile, my relationship with both Ryan and Sophia began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Our weekly phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I visited San Diego, they seemed distracted and eager for me to leave. Sophia, in particular, became increasingly dismissive of my opinions and suggestions, often cutting me off mid-sentence or changing the subject when I tried to contribute to conversations. The shift became more pronounced when they announced their engagement 18 months ago. I was overjoyed and immediately offered to help with wedding planning, assuming we would work together to create a beautiful celebration within a reasonable budget. Instead, Sophia presented me with a vision that seemed lifted from a luxury wedding magazine. The venue alone cost more than I earned in 6 months. "Don't worry about the budget, Margaret," Sophia said with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand when I gently suggested some cost-saving alternatives. "Ryan and I have been saving for this for months. We want our wedding to be absolutely perfect, and you can't put a price on perfection." But as the wedding planning progressed, it became clear that their savings were nowhere near sufficient for the extravaganza Sophia had envisioned. The requests for financial assistance multiplied exponentially. The photographer alone cost $8,000. The flowers were another $6,000. The dress, shoes, and accessories totaled nearly $15,000. Each expense was presented as absolutely essential to achieving the wedding of Sophia's dreams. I found myself liquidating my investment accounts, taking out loans against my house, and working 7 days a week to fund their fairy tale. When I expressed concern about the mounting costs, Sophia became defensive and Ryan backed her up completely. "Mom, this is our one chance to have the perfect wedding," he said during a particularly tense phone conversation. "Sophia's parents are already contributing so much. We just need a little extra help to make everything come together." The mention of Sophia's parents' contributions was particularly painful because I rarely saw evidence of their financial support. When I attended family dinners at the Martinez house, Carlos and Isabella were always gracious hosts, but they never mentioned the wedding expenses or acknowledged my contributions. In fact, they seemed to assume that Ryan's family was well off, enough to handle their share of the costs without difficulty. As the wedding date approached, I had exhausted nearly every financial resource available to me. My retirement account was depleted, my savings were gone, and I had taken out a second mortgage on my house to cover the final expenses. I was working 18-hour days, surviving on caffeine and determination, and barely sleeping. My friends began expressing concern about my appearance and health, but I brushed off their worries. This was for Ryan's happiness, and that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The bridal shower was scheduled for 3 weeks before the wedding at an upscale country club in La Jolla. Sophia had initially planned to have her mother host the event, but when Isabella mentioned that their recent restaurant expansion had stretched their finances, Sophia immediately turned to me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Margaret, would you mind terribly hosting my bridal shower? I know it's a lot to ask, but you're so good at organizing things and I trust your taste completely." I was actually touched that she had asked me to take on such an important role. Finally, here was an opportunity to be truly involved in the wedding preparations, to show Sophia and her friends what I could accomplish when given the chance. I threw myself into planning the perfect bridal shower with the same dedication I brought to my most important real estate deals. I researched venues for weeks before settling on the Ocean View Country Club, primarily because it offered the elegance Sophia expected at a price I could somehow manage. The rental fee alone was $3,000, but I convinced myself that this would be my gift to Sophia, a way to show her how much I valued her place in our family. I spent hours planning every detail, from the ivory and gold color scheme to the elaborate floral arrangements that would complement the venue's ocean views. The menu was another significant expense. Sophia had very specific preferences, insisting on past hors d'oeuvres rather than a buffet, premium wine selections, and a custom cake from the city's most exclusive bakery. When I saw the catering estimate of $8,000, I felt physically ill, but I had already committed to hosting the event. I took out a personal loan to cover the costs, telling myself that this would be the last major expense before the wedding. The guest list included 45 women, primarily Sophia's sorority sisters, work colleagues, and extended family members. I knew only a handful of them personally, but I was determined to make a good impression on behalf of Ryan and our family. I spent additional money on personalized favors, upgraded linens, and professional photography to ensure that every moment would be captured perfectly. The morning of the bridal shower, I arrived at the country club 3 hours early to oversee the setup. The florist had delivered stunning arrangements of white peonies and gold accents that transformed the private dining room into something worthy of a magazine spread. The caterers had prepared elegant displays of food that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Everything was exactly as Sophia had envisioned, and I felt a surge of pride at what I had accomplished. When Sophia arrived with her bridesmaids, she looked absolutely radiant in a flowing white dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She made a show of admiring the decorations and thanking me for my efforts, though I noticed she spent more time posing for photos than actually acknowledging the work I had put into every detail. Still, I was happy to see her enjoying herself, and felt confident that the event would be everything she had hoped for. The first hour of the shower proceeded smoothly. Guests mingled with cocktails, admired the decorations, and complimented the food presentation. I circulated among the groups, introducing myself to women I hadn't met and sharing stories about Ryan's childhood when asked. Several guests mentioned how lovely everything looked and how fortunate Sophia was to have such a thoughtful future mother-in-law. Their comments filled me with warmth and validation that all my sacrifices had been worthwhile. Isabella Martinez arrived fashionably late, making a grand entrance in a designer ensemble that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in an entire year. She air-kissed me on both cheeks and complimented the venue choice, though I detected a note of surprise in her voice, as if she hadn't expected me to pull off something so sophisticated. "Margaret, this is absolutely beautiful," she said with what seemed like genuine admiration. "Sophia is so lucky to have you taking care of all these details." The gift-opening portion of the shower revealed the vast disparity between my world and Sophia's. Her friends presented her with items from expensive registry stores, crystal stemware, designer handbags, luxury spa packages. Isabella's gift was a stunning set of pearl jewelry that had been in their family for generations. When my turn came, I presented Sophia with a carefully chosen collection of items I had noticed her admiring during our shopping trips together, including a cashmere throw and matching pillows for their new apartment. Sophia opened my gift with appropriate enthusiasm, though I caught her exchanging a quick glance with one of her bridesmaids that I couldn't quite interpret. "Thank you so much, Margaret," she said, holding up the throw for everyone to see. "This is lovely. So practical." The word practical stung slightly, though I told myself she meant it as a compliment. As the afternoon progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in the dynamics of the party. Conversations would quiet when I approached certain groups, then resume with different topics once I moved on. Several times I caught guests looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Curiosity? I pushed these observations aside, focusing instead on ensuring that everyone had enough food and drink, and that the photographer was capturing all the important moments. The turning point came during the traditional toast portion of the shower. Isabella had prepared remarks about welcoming Sophia into their family traditions and expressing excitement about the upcoming wedding. Several bridesmaids shared funny stories about their friendships with Sophia and offered advice for married life. When the microphone was passed to me, I stood up with prepared comments about how grateful I was to gain a daughter and how much joy Sophia brought to Ryan's life. But before I could begin speaking, Sophia stood up and reached for the microphone with a bright smile. "Actually, I'd like to say something first," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate with me. Your presence means the world to me, and I'm so grateful for all the love and support you've shown." She paused, taking a sip of champagne before continuing. I also want to acknowledge Margaret Thompson, my future mother-in-law, who made today possible. My heart swelled with anticipation, finally expecting the public recognition I had craved. Margaret has been so generous with her time and resources throughout our engagement. In fact, I think it's fair to say that she's only here today because she paid for the food. The room erupted in laughter, but not the warm, inclusive kind that brings people together. This was sharp, knowing laughter that made me feel like I was standing outside looking in. Several guests glanced at me with expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed pity. I felt my face burning with embarrassment as I realized that everyone in the room knew about my financial contributions to the wedding and probably viewed me as someone trying to buy my way into their acceptance. Sophia continued speaking, seemingly oblivious to my distress. But seriously, Margaret has been incredibly supportive, and we're so thankful for everything she's done to make our special day possible. Cheers to Margaret! She raised her glass, and the room followed suit, but the gesture felt more mocking than celebratory. I managed to maintain my composure long enough to excuse myself to the restroom, where I locked myself in a stall and finally allowed the tears to fall. The humiliation was overwhelming, but even worse was the realization that this was how Sophia truly saw me. Not as a loving future family member, but as a convenient source of funding who could be dismissed and ridiculed once my usefulness was acknowledged. When I returned to the party, I struggled to engage in conversations, feeling like everyone was viewing me through the lens of Sophia's cruel comment. The remainder of the shower passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical responses to well-wishers. I helped clean up after the guests departed, mechanically packing leftover food and ensuring that all of Sophia's gifts were safely loaded into her car. As I drove home that evening, I replayed Sophia's words over and over in my mind. The casual cruelty of reducing my presence to my financial contribution was devastating enough, but the laughter that followed revealed how little respect she and her friends had for me. I had spent years sacrificing my financial security and personal well-being to support their relationship, and this was how I was repaid, with public humiliation disguised as gratitude. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the stack of bills that had accumulated while I focused on wedding expenses. Credit card statements, loan payment notices, and past due utility bills painted a stark picture of my financial reality. I had been so focused on creating perfect moments for Ryan and Sophia that I had completely neglected my own stability and well-being. The phone rang around 9 o'clock, and Ryan's name appeared on the caller ID. For a moment, I hoped he was calling to apologize for Sophia's behavior or to check on how I was feeling after the difficult afternoon. Instead, his voice was casual and upbeat as he thanked me for hosting such a beautiful shower and mentioned how much Sophia had enjoyed herself. "Did you hear Sophia's toast?" I asked carefully, testing whether he had been aware of the humiliation I had endured. Ryan laughed, apparently finding nothing troubling about his fiancée's words. "Yeah, she's got such a great sense of humor. Everyone was cracking up. You've been such a sport about everything, Mom. Sophia and I are so lucky to have you in our corner." His casual dismissal of my feelings was almost as painful as Sophia's original comment. Clearly, neither of them understood how deeply their treatment had affected me, or perhaps they simply didn't care. I ended the call quickly, claiming fatigue, and spent the rest of the evening in stunned silence. Over the following days, I found myself replaying not just the bridal shower incident, but the entire trajectory of my relationship with Ryan and Sophia. When had I stopped being a valued family member and become merely a source of financial support? When had my opinions, feelings, and well-being become secondary to their desires and ambitions? The answers were painful, but clear. Every time I had said yes to another financial request without setting boundaries, every time I had prioritized their wants over my needs, every time I had accepted dismissive treatment because I was afraid, of losing their affection, I had trained them to see me as someone whose primary value lay in my willingness to pay for their lifestyle. 3 weeks later, as I sat in the front row of the church watching Ryan and Sophia exchange vows in a ceremony that had cost me nearly everything I had worked for, I made a decision that would change the course of all our lives. I could no longer continue enabling a relationship dynamic that was destroying my financial security and emotional well-being. It was time to set boundaries, even if it meant risking the very relationships I had been trying so desperately to preserve. What I discovered in the months that followed would prove that my decision to step back had been even more necessary than I could have imagined. The truth about Ryan and Sophia's real situation would shock me to my core and force me to confront the devastating reality of how completely I had been deceived by the two people I loved most. The wedding reception was held at the Grand Pacific Hotel, an oceanfront venue that commanded breathtaking views of the San Diego coastline. As I watched Ryan and Sophia's first dance under crystal chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in my son's happiness warred with the bitter memory of Sophia's humiliating comment at the bridal shower. The elegant ballroom, filled with 200 guests enjoying premium champagne and gourmet cuisine, represented the culmination of months of financial sacrifice that had left me teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. During the reception, I sat at a table with distant relatives I barely knew, watching as Sophia's family and friends celebrated in their designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Isabella Martinez held court at the head table, regaling guests with stories about the elaborate honeymoon Ryan and Sophia had planned for Italy. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I had funded much of their wedding, I couldn't afford a vacation for myself and hadn't taken more than a long weekend off work in over 2 years. When the bouquet toss occurred, I watched from the sidelines, as young women eagerly positioned themselves to catch Sophia's elaborate arrangement of white roses and baby's breath. The flowers landed in the hands of her college roommate, who squealed with delight while everyone cheered. I remembered my own wedding day 34 years ago, when David and I had celebrated modestly with close family and friends in the community center back in Millbrook. Our entire wedding budget had been less than what Sophia spent on her shoes. The honeymoon departure the next morning was another orchestrated production. Ryan and Sophia posed for photos outside their hotel, surrounded by luggage that suggested they were moving permanently rather than taking a 2-week vacation. When Ryan hugged me goodbye, he whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom. We couldn't have done this without you." His words should have brought comfort, but instead, they felt like confirmation that my value to them was primarily financial. During the 3 weeks they were in Europe, I began the sobering process of assessing my financial situation. The numbers were even worse than I had feared. Between the wedding expenses, bridal shower costs, and various other contributions over the past 4 years, I had spent nearly $200,000 supporting Ryan and Sophia's lifestyle. My retirement accounts were depleted, my house carried a substantial second mortgage, and my credit cards were maxed out with payments I could barely manage. I made an appointment with Patricia Hernandez, a financial advisor who had been recommended by one of my real estate clients. Patricia's office was located in a sleek downtown building, and her professional demeanor immediately put me at ease. When I explained my situation, she listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about my assets, debts, and income. After reviewing my financial documents, Patricia delivered her assessment with gentle but unmistakable concern. "Margaret, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you need to hear this clearly. Your current financial trajectory is unsustainable. If you continue on this path without major changes, you'll be forced to sell your house within the next 18 months and will have virtually nothing saved for retirement." Her words hit me like a physical blow, though they merely confirmed what I had been trying to ignore. "What would you recommend?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Patricia leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. You need to immediately stop all non-essential financial support to your son and his wife. I understand that's difficult from an emotional standpoint, but from a financial perspective, it's absolutely critical. You also need to develop an aggressive debt reduction plan and possibly consider downsizing your living situation. The concept of refusing Ryan's requests for money felt foreign and frightening. For years, my identity had been intertwined with my ability to provide for him, to smooth his path and enable his dreams. The thought of saying no felt like abandoning my fundamental role as his mother. When Ryan and Sophia returned from their honeymoon, they were glowing with tales of romantic dinners in Rome, wine tastings in Tuscany, and shopping excursions in Milan. They had purchased art, clothing, and souvenirs that filled multiple suitcases, apparently unconcerned about the cost despite their supposed financial constraints. Ryan showed me photos on his phone of their luxury hotel suites and first-class flight experiences, describing each extravagance with enthusiasm. 2 days after their return, Ryan called with the request I had been dreading. "Mom, I hate to bother you so soon after we got back, but we've run into a little situation. The honeymoon ended up costing more than we budgeted, and our rent is due next week. Could you possibly help us out with $4,000, just until Sophia's business picks up again?" This was the moment Patricia had prepared me for, but actually saying no felt like stepping off a cliff. "Ryan, I need to talk to you about something important. I've been reviewing my finances, and I can't continue providing financial support the way I have been. I'm facing serious debt problems and need to focus on my own financial stability." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably, before Ryan responded with obvious frustration. "Mom, this is really bad timing. We just got married. We're trying to establish our life together, and now you're pulling back? I thought family meant supporting each other through difficult times." His words stung because they twisted my decision to protect my financial future into an act of betrayal. "I've been supporting you through difficult times for 4 years. Ryan, I've spent my retirement savings, taken out loans against my house, and worked myself to exhaustion. I need you and Sophia to find ways to support yourselves now." The conversation deteriorated quickly. Ryan accused me of choosing money over family, of withdrawing my love when he needed me most, of timing my decision to cause maximum stress during their adjustment period as newlyweds. Each accusation felt like a dagger, particularly because they ignored the years of sacrifice I had made and the precarious financial position those sacrifices had created. When I stood firm in my decision, Ryan's tone shifted from disappointment to anger. "Fine, Mom. If that's how you want to be, we'll figure it out ourselves. But don't expect us to pretend everything is normal between us when you've basically abandoned us right after our wedding." The call ended abruptly, leaving me shaking with a combination of grief and determination. I had known that setting boundaries would be difficult, but I hadn't anticipated the immediate hostility and emotional manipulation that followed my decision. Over the following days, both Ryan and Sophia began a campaign designed to make me reconsider my position. Sophia called tearfully, explaining that they were facing eviction from their apartment and couldn't understand why I was being so heartless during their time of need. Ryan sent text messages describing their financial stress and questioning whether I had ever truly loved him if I could abandon him so easily. The emotional pressure was overwhelming, but I forced myself to remember Patricia's warnings about my own financial security. I had spent decades building a career and accumulating assets, and I couldn't allow guilt and manipulation to destroy everything I had worked for. Still, the silence from Ryan and Sophia felt like a physical ache, a constant reminder of the price I was paying for finally saying no. 3 weeks after I had refused Ryan's request for money, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Carlos. Martinez appeared at my reception desk one Thursday afternoon, his expensive suit and confident demeanor commanding immediate attention from my assistant. When she announced his arrival, I felt a flutter of nervousness about why Sophia's father would want to meet with me privately. Carlos settled into the chair across from my desk with practiced ease, declining my offer of coffee with a polite wave. His dark eyes were serious as he studied me for a moment before speaking. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I felt we needed to have a conversation about Ryan and Sophia's situation." I nodded cautiously, unsure what direction this conversation might take. Carlos had always been cordial during family gatherings, but we had never discussed personal matters in depth. "I'm going to be direct with you," Carlos continued, "because I think there are things you need to know. Sophia came to us last week asking for money to cover their rent and living expenses. When I asked her what had happened to the financial support you had been providing, she explained that you had suddenly cut them off without warning. The characterization of my decision as sudden stung, given the years of mounting requests, and my deteriorating financial situation. I explained to Ryan that I can no longer provide financial support. I've been helping them for 4 years, and it's put me in a very difficult position financially." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I suspected. Margaret, I want you to know that Isabella and I have been concerned about this dynamic for some time. We've watched you sacrifice tremendously for their lifestyle, and frankly, we've been uncomfortable with how much they've come to depend on your generosity." His words surprised me. I had assumed that the Martinez family viewed my contributions as normal and expected, given their own wealth and social standing. "There's something else you should know," Carlos said, his expression growing more serious. "When Sophia asked us for money, she mentioned that she expected this arrangement to be temporary because she anticipated receiving support from your estate eventually. She seemed to believe that you were wealthy enough to sustain their lifestyle indefinitely." The revelation that Sophia had been counting on my eventual death to fund their future was breathtaking in its callousness. I felt physically sick as I processed the implication that they had viewed me not as a person deserving love and respect, but as a financial asset to be managed and eventually inherited. Carlos leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Margaret, I turned down Sophia's request for money, and I explained to her that Isabella and I believe it's time for her and Ryan to learn to support themselves. We've decided that we will no longer enable their financial dependence, and I wanted to encourage you to maintain your boundaries as well." The validation from Carlos felt like a lifeline. Here was someone from their world, someone whose opinion Sophia valued, confirming that my decision had been appropriate and necessary. "Thank you for telling me this," I said quietly. "I've been questioning whether I made the right choice, especially with all the pressure they've been applying." "You absolutely made the right choice," Carlos said emphatically. "In fact, you probably should have done it years ago." Isabella and I have raised 4 children, and we learned early that rescuing them from every financial difficulty only prevents them from developing the skills and judgment they need to succeed independently. After Carlos left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing everything he had shared. The knowledge that Sophia had been planning to depend on my inheritance was particularly disturbing because it suggested a level of entitlement and calculation that went far beyond simple financial irresponsibility. She had been viewing me as a resource to be exploited, both in life and in death. That evening, I decided to take action based on Carlos's revelations. I called my attorney, James Morrison, and scheduled an appointment to review and update my will. If Sophia and Ryan were counting on inheriting assets that would fund their lifestyle, they needed to understand that continued financial irresponsibility would have consequences. James had handled my legal affairs since David's death, and he understood my family dynamics well enough to grasp the significance of my concerns. When I explained the situation, he recommended adding specific provisions to my will that would protect any inheritance from being squandered on frivolous expenses or used to enable continued financial dependence. "We can establish a trust structure that would provide income while protecting the principal," James explained. We can also include provisions that require financial responsibility and independence before any distributions are made. This would ensure that any inheritance actually benefits Ryan rather than simply funding poor financial choices. The process of updating my will forced me to confront the reality that my relationship with Ryan might never recover from the boundaries I had established. The son who had once called me his best friend now viewed me as an obstacle to his desired lifestyle. The recognition that our relationship had been built on financial dependence rather than genuine affection was heartbreaking, but necessary. Meanwhile, Ryan and Sophia's financial situation continued to deteriorate. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that they had been forced to move to a smaller apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. Sophia's event planning business was struggling, partly because she had never developed the discipline and work ethic necessary to build a sustainable enterprise. Ryan's job at the tech startup was secure, but his salary alone wasn't sufficient to maintain the lifestyle they had become accustomed to with my financial support. The silence between us stretched into months. I occasionally received brief, impersonal text messages on holidays or my birthday, but the warm, frequent communication we had once shared was gone. Part of me grieved for the relationship we had lost, while another part recognized that what I was mourning might have been an illusion built on financial dependence rather than genuine love. 6 months after I had refused Ryan's request for money, I received a phone call that would change everything. The caller was Detective Sarah Chen from the San Diego Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Her professional but concerned tone immediately put me on alert. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling because your name has come up in connection with an ongoing investigation. I'd like to meet with you to discuss some financial transactions involving your son Ryan Thompson and his wife Sophia Martinez Thompson. Would you be available to come to the station tomorrow?" My hands trembled as I agreed to the meeting, my mind racing through possibilities of what kind of investigation might involve Ryan and Sophia. Had they been victims of fraud? Were they in some kind of legal trouble? The uncertainty was agonizing, but I knew I would have answers soon. Detective Chen's office was a small, functional space decorated only with family photos and commendation certificates. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a direct manner that inspired confidence. After offering me coffee and ensuring I was comfortable, she opened a thick file folder that contained what appeared to be numerous financial documents. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to start by saying that you're not in any legal trouble. However, we have reason to believe that you may have been the victim of a sophisticated financial fraud scheme. The investigation began when several local businesses reported suspicious credit applications and loan documents that contained false information." My confusion must have been evident because Detective Chen continued with more specific details. "We've discovered that someone has been using your financial information, including your social security number, income details, and credit history, to obtain loans and credit accounts. The person or persons responsible have been very careful to make minimum payments to avoid immediate detection, but the fraud has been ongoing for approximately 3 years." The timeline made my blood run cold. 3 years ago was when Ryan's financial requests had begun escalating significantly. "Who would have access to my financial information?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the devastating answer. Detective Chen consulted her notes before responding. "The fraudulent applications were submitted using detailed knowledge of your employment history, income levels, and existing accounts. This suggests someone with intimate access to your personal financial information. In several cases, the applications listed your address as a previous residence for the applicants." She pulled out a series of credit applications and loan documents, sliding them across the desk for me to examine. The signatures were expertly forged versions of my own, and the personal information was accurate enough to pass most verification processes. But what made my heart stop was seeing Ryan and Sophia's current address listed as the mailing address for several of the accounts. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize your son and daughter-in-law to use your personal information to obtain credit or loans?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I never authorized anything like this." Detective Chen's expression was compassionate but professional. "Based on our investigation, we believe that Ryan Thompson and Sophia Martinez Thompson have fraudulently obtained approximately $67,000 in credit and loans using your identity. They've been making minimum payments to avoid immediate detection, but several accounts are now approaching their limits." The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Not only had Ryan and Sophia been manipulating me into providing financial support, but they had also been stealing my identity to obtain additional funds. The son I had raised, whom I had sacrificed everything to support, had been systematically defrauding me for years. "What happens now?" I asked, struggling to process the implications of this revelation. Detective Chen explained the legal process that would unfold. I would need to file identity theft reports with the credit bureaus, work with the affected financial institutions to dispute the fraudulent accounts, and decide whether to press criminal charges against Ryan and Sophia. The investigation was ongoing, and additional evidence might reveal the full scope of their fraudulent activities. As I drove home from the police station, I felt numb with shock and betrayal. The son I had loved unconditionally, whom I had supported financially and emotionally throughout his life, had repaid my devotion with systematic theft and deception. The financial support I had provided willingly was apparently insufficient for their desired lifestyle, so they had simply taken what they wanted through fraud and forgery. That evening, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the pile of financial documents Detective Chen had given me. Each fraudulent application represented another layer of deception, another violation of the trust I had placed in my own child. The careful forgeries of my signature were particularly painful because they demonstrated premeditation and planning rather than impulsive desperation. The phone rang around 8 o'clock, and Ryan's name appeared on the caller ID. For a moment, I wondered if somehow he had learned about the police investigation and was calling to confess or apologize. Instead, his voice was casual and friendly, as if nothing had changed between us. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Sophia and I have been thinking about you lately." The normalcy of his tone, given what I had learned that day, was surreal. "Ryan," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something important. Have you used my personal information to apply for any credit cards or loans?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to confirm my worst fears. "When?" Ryan finally responded. His voice had changed from casual friendliness to defensive anger. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. Why would you even ask something like that?" "Because the police contacted me today about an identity theft investigation. They have evidence that someone has been using my information to obtain credit, and the accounts are connected to your address." Ryan's protests became increasingly frantic and contradictory. He claimed ignorance, then suggested that someone else must have stolen both our identities, then accused me of trying to get him in trouble because I was angry about their financial independence. The lies tumbled over each other in a desperate attempt to maintain the deception that had been exposed. Finally, faced with the weight of evidence, Ryan's story began to crumble. "Okay, maybe I used your information once or twice, but only because we were desperate. You had stopped helping us and we had bills to pay. I always planned to tell you and pay everything back." The casual admission of multiple felonies, delivered as if they were minor mistakes rather than serious crimes, demonstrated how completely Ryan had lost his moral compass. The son I had raised to be honest and responsible had become someone capable of sustained deception and theft against his own mother. "Ryan," I said, my voice steady despite the heartbreak threatening to overwhelm me, "you've committed identity theft and fraud. These are serious crimes, and there will be consequences." His response was immediate and vicious. "You're really going to send your own son to jail over money? After everything Sophia and I have been through? You're the one who made us dependent on you in the first place by always offering to help. Now you want to destroy our lives because we found another way to survive? The attempt to blame me for his criminal behavior was breathtaking in its audacity, but it also revealed the depth of his delusion. In Ryan's mind, my financial support had been an obligation rather than a gift, and my refusal to continue funding their lifestyle justified any measures they took to maintain it. The conversation ended with Ryan hanging up abruptly, but not before threatening to ensure that I would never see any future grandchildren if I pursued criminal charges. The threat was clearly designed to manipulate my emotions and force me to protect him from the consequences of his actions, just as I had been doing financially for years. That night, I lay awake grappling with the most difficult decision of my life. Pressing charges against Ryan and Sophia would mean acknowledging publicly that my own son had betrayed and stolen from me. It would likely end our relationship permanently and subject our family to the scrutiny and judgment of a criminal trial. But failing to hold them accountable would enable their continued criminal behavior and potentially make me complicit in their fraud. The next morning brought unexpected clarity. Carlos Martinez called to inform me that he and Isabella had also been contacted by Detective Chen. Apparently, Ryan and Sophia had attempted to use the Martinez family's business information to obtain additional credit, though their efforts had been unsuccessful due to more sophisticated fraud detection systems. "Margaret," Carlos said, his voice grim, "I want you to know that Isabella and I support whatever decision you make about pressing charges. What Ryan and Sophia have done is unconscionable, and they need to face the full consequences of their actions." The support from Carlos and Isabella, combined with the knowledge that Ryan and Sophia had also targeted them for fraud, reinforced my growing conviction that accountability was necessary. These weren't desperate mistakes made in a moment of panic, but calculated crimes committed over years with increasing sophistication and scope. 2 days later, I returned to Detective Chen's office to provide additional information and formally press charges against Ryan and Sophia. The process was emotionally devastating but necessary. As I signed the complaint documents, I felt like I was signing the death certificate for the relationship I had once cherished with my son. The arrests happened the following week. Detective Chen called to inform me that Ryan and Sophia had been taken into custody at their apartment and charged with multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, and forgery. The local news picked up the story, describing it as a case of financial elder abuse perpetrated by family members against a victim who had previously supported them voluntarily. Seeing my family's private tragedy reduced to a cautionary news story was humiliating, but it also brought unexpected support from friends and colleagues who reached out to express their sympathy and admiration for my courage in holding Ryan and Sophia accountable. Many shared their own stories of financial exploitation by family members, helping me understand that my experience, while devastating, was not unique. The legal proceedings stretched over several months, with plea negotiations and court appearances that forced me to relive the betrayal repeatedly. Ryan and Sophia eventually accepted plea agreements that included restitution, probation, and community service, avoiding prison time but accepting felony convictions that would affect their future, employment, and financial prospects. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to address the court about the impact of their crimes on my life. Standing at the podium, looking at Ryan and Sophia in the defendant's table, I felt a complex mixture of love, grief, and determination as I spoke about the financial and emotional devastation they had caused. "Your Honor," I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. "The defendants are my son and daughter-in-law, people I loved and supported for years. Their betrayal has cost me not only my financial security, but also my faith in the family relationships I cherished most. However, I hope that facing the consequences of their actions will help them understand the difference between love and exploitation, between family support and criminal behavior." As I returned to my seat, I caught Ryan's eye for the first time since the investigation began. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the young man I had raised. someone who might finally be beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the sullen resentment that had characterized his attitude throughout the legal proceedings. The judge's final comments before imposing sentence addressed the particular cruelty of financial crimes committed against family members. The victims of identity theft suffer not only financial harm, but also a profound violation of trust. When that violation is perpetrated by family members, the emotional damage is often irreparable. The defendants in this case exploited the love and generosity of someone who had already sacrificed tremendously for their benefit. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing throughout the long months of investigation and legal proceedings. Justice had been served, even though it had come at the cost of destroying my relationship with my son. The boundaries I had established 6 months earlier had been necessary not just for my financial protection, but to expose criminal behavior that might have continued indefinitely. The year that followed brought both challenges and unexpected joys, as I rebuilt my life without the constant stress of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. The restitution payments from Ryan and Sophia, combined with my renewed focus on my career and financial stability, began to repair some of the damage their fraud had caused. More importantly, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under years of enabling and people-pleasing. For the first time in decades, I was free to pursue my own interests and relationships without the constant pressure of Ryan's demands and Sophia's expectations. The liberation was both exhilarating and terrifying, as I learned to define my worth through my own accomplishments rather than my ability to provide for others. The morning after the sentencing, I woke up in my house for the first time in years without the crushing weight of financial anxiety pressing down on my chest. The legal proceedings were finally over, and while the emotional scars would take much longer to heal, I felt a sense of freedom that had been absent from my life for so long I had almost forgotten what it felt like. The silence in my home was no longer filled with the dread of Ryan's next financial crisis or Sophia's veiled demands disguised as family obligations. I made coffee in my kitchen and sat at the small breakfast table where I had once worried endlessly about how to afford their next request. Now, for the first time in years, I could plan my own financial future without having to account for their unpredictable needs. The restitution payments from Ryan and Sophia would help repair some of the damage to my credit and retirement savings, but more importantly, I was finally free to make decisions based on my own well-being rather than their endless appetites. Patricia Hernandez had become more than just my financial advisor during the difficult months of legal proceedings. She had provided emotional support and practical guidance as I worked to rebuild my financial foundation. When I met with her, the week after the sentencing, she spread out charts and projections that showed a dramatically different future than the bleak scenario we had discussed a year earlier. "Margaret, the changes you've made have been remarkable," Patricia said, pointing to the graphs that tracked my debt reduction and asset recovery. "By eliminating the drain of constant financial support and adding the restitution payments, you've actually improved your long-term outlook significantly. If you continue on this path, you could still retire comfortably, though perhaps a few years later than originally planned." The numbers on Patricia's charts represented more than just financial recovery. They represented the possibility of a future where I could make choices based on my own desires rather than constant crisis management. For the first time in years, I could envision taking a vacation, pursuing hobbies, or even considering a relationship without the constant background noise of financial stress and family drama. One of the unexpected consequences of the legal proceedings had been the reconnection with old friends who had reached out during the news coverage of Ryan and Sophia's arrests. Many of them confessed that they had been concerned about my situation for years but hadn't known how to address it without seeming intrusive or judgmental. The support from these relationships, which had been neglected during my years of focusing exclusively on Ryan's needs, provided a foundation for rebuilding my social connections. Linda Morrison, a college friend who had moved to San Diego for work, called me 3 weeks after the sentencing to suggest meeting for lunch. We had maintained sporadic contact over the years, usually limited to holiday cards and brief social media interactions, but Linda had followed the news coverage and wanted to offer her support in person. "Margaret, I have to be honest with you," Linda said over salads at a quiet restaurant near the beach. "Those of us who knew you in college have been worried about you for years. Every time we saw you at reunions or social events, you seemed increasingly stressed and exhausted. We could see you pouring everything into Ryan, but it didn't seem to be making any of you happier." Her observation stung because it highlighted how obvious my situation had been to outside observers, while I had been trapped in the cycle of enabling and financial sacrifice. "I thought I was being a good mother," I admitted. "I thought that supporting him financially was showing love and helping him build a successful life." Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "You were being a loving mother, but you were also being taken advantage of by people who should have protected and cherished you. There's a difference between supporting your children and allowing them to exploit your generosity." The conversation with Linda opened the door to other reconnections with people who had been pushed to the periphery of my life during the years I had spent focused exclusively on Ryan and Sophia's needs. I began accepting invitations to social events, joining a book club that met monthly at the local library, and even considering a pottery class that I had always wanted to try but never had time for. The pottery class proved to be a revelation. The instructor, Maria Santos, was a patient woman in her 60s who had been teaching ceramics for over 20 years. She created an atmosphere in the studio that encouraged creativity and experimentation, without judgment or pressure. For the first time in years, I was engaging in an activity purely for my own enjoyment, with no ulterior motive or obligation to anyone else. Working with clay became a form of meditation and therapy. The physical act of shaping and molding the material helped me process the emotional upheaval of the past year while creating something beautiful and tangible. When my first successful bowl emerged from the kiln, glazed in shades of blue and green that reminded me of the ocean, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or needs. The other students in the pottery class became an unexpected source of friendship and support. There was Helen, a retired teacher who had started ceramics after her husband's death, and Robert, a divorced accountant who found that working with clay helped him manage stress from his demanding job. These relationships developed naturally around our shared interest rather than obligation or financial dependence, creating a healthier model for human connection than I had experienced in years. 6 months after the legal proceedings ended, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address showed Isabella Martinez's name, and I opened it with curiosity mixed with apprehension. Isabella's handwriting was elegant and flowing as she expressed her family's continued regret about Ryan and Sophia's behavior, and their gratitude for my courage in holding them accountable. "Margaret," the letter read, "Carlos and I have been discussing the situation extensively, and we feel compelled to share some information that you deserve to know. During our own investigation into Sophia's activities, we discovered that she had been manipulating both our families far more extensively than any of us realized. Her event planning business was essentially a front for soliciting money from various sources under false pretenses. She had convinced several clients to pay large deposits for services she never intended to provide." The letter continued with details about additional fraudulent activities that Sophia had been conducting, parallel to the identity theft scheme she had perpetrated against me. She had been running a sophisticated operation that involved multiple victims and false business entities. The scope of her deception was staggering and demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond the desperate measures of someone facing temporary financial difficulties. "We wanted you to know," Isabella's letter concluded, "that your decision to press charges has likely prevented many other people from becoming victims of Sophia's schemes. You showed tremendous courage in a situation where many people would have chosen to protect their family's reputation at the expense of justice." Reading Isabella's letter provided a sense of validation that my difficult decisions had been not only necessary but beneficial for other potential victims. The knowledge that Ryan and Sophia's crimes extended far beyond their exploitation of my generosity helped me understand that their behavior represented a fundamental character defect, rather than a temporary lapse in judgment driven by financial pressure. Around the same time, I began receiving updates about Ryan and Sophia's situation through mutual acquaintances and court records. Their marriage had not survived the stress of the legal proceedings and the loss of their financial safety nets. Sophia had moved back in with her parents temporarily while serving her probation, and Ryan had relocated to a studio apartment across town where he was struggling to rebuild his life with the burden of a felony conviction. The information about their separation brought me a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me felt sadness that their relationship, which I had supported and invested in for so many years, had ultimately failed. Another part of me wondered whether their marriage had ever been based on genuine love and compatibility, or primarily on their shared ability to exploit my financial support and maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. 8 months after the sentencing, I made the decision to put my house on the market. The Victorian home that had once represented all my dreams and memories had become a symbol of the financial sacrifices I had made for people who didn't value or appreciate them. The mortgage payments, particularly the second mortgage I had taken out to fund wedding expenses, were still a significant burden that limited my financial flexibility and retirement planning. The decision to sell wasn't easy, as the house contained decades of memories from my marriage to David and Ryan's childhood. However, I realized that clinging to the physical structure wouldn't preserve the meaningful relationships it had once contained, and the financial freedom that selling would provide was more important than maintaining a shrine to a past that could never be recovered. The real estate market in Millbrook had improved significantly since I had purchased the house 30 years earlier, and the location in the historic district had become increasingly desirable. When I listed the property, I received multiple offers within the first week, several of which were above the asking price. The final sale price was sufficient to pay off both mortgages, eliminate my remaining debts, and provide a substantial down payment for a smaller, more manageable home. I found a charming cottage in a quiet neighborhood about 10 minutes from my old house. The new home had 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a small garden where I could practice the horticultural skills I was learning in my pottery class community. The mortgage payment was half of what I had been paying for the Victorian house, and the reduced financial burden felt like lifting a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The process of moving forced me to confront decades of accumulated possessions and decide what truly mattered to me. I donated boxes of Ryan's childhood memorabilia that I had been saving for grandchildren who might never exist, sold furniture that had been chosen to impress visitors rather than for my own comfort, and kept only the items that brought me genuine joy or served practical purposes in my new life. One of the most difficult decisions involved the wedding photos and mementos from Ryan and Sophia's wedding. These expensive albums and keepsakes represented thousands of dollars and months of planning, but they also embodied the most painful period of my life. After much consideration, I packed them away in a storage box in my attic, neither displaying them nor throwing them away, acknowledging their existence without allowing them to dominate my living space. The cottage gradually became a reflection of my new priorities and interests. I set up a small studio space where I could work on pottery projects at home, created a reading nook with comfortable seating and good lighting, and planted a garden with vegetables and flowers that I chose purely because I enjoyed them. For the first time in years, my living space was arranged for my own comfort and pleasure, rather than to accommodate other people's needs or impress visitors with my success. As my first year of independence progressed, I began to attract the attention of someone who would become increasingly important in my new life. Dr. Marcus Webb was a semi-retired physician who had started taking pottery classes as a way to manage the stress of transitioning away from his medical practice. He was a gentle, thoughtful man in his early 60s who had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier and was slowly rebuilding his social connections. Marcus and I initially connected over our shared struggles with creating even, symmetrical, pottery pieces. He had steady hands from years of surgery, but ceramics required a different kind of precision and patience than medical procedures. Our conversations during class breaks revealed that we had both experienced significant life changes in recent years and were learning to redefine ourselves outside of our primary relationships and responsibilities. Our first official date was a visit to a ceramics exhibition at the San Diego Museum of Art. Marcus picked me up in his sensible sedan, dressed casually but nicely in khakis and a button-down shirt that complemented his silver hair and kind eyes. We spent hours walking through the galleries, discussing the techniques and aesthetics of different pieces while gradually sharing more personal stories about our respective journeys. "I have to admit," Marcus said over coffee in the museum cafe, "I was nervous about starting to date again. After 40 years of marriage, the whole process feels foreign and intimidating." His honesty about his own vulnerability made it easier for me to share my own concerns about trusting someone new after the betrayal I had experienced from Ryan and Sophia. "I'm still learning to distinguish between normal relationship boundaries and the hypervigilance that comes from being exploited," I confessed. "Sometimes I worry that I'll either be too suspicious or too giving." Marcus nodded understandingly. "I think the fact that you're aware of those tendencies is probably the best protection against repeating unhealthy patterns. Self-awareness is half the battle in building better relationships." Our relationship developed slowly and naturally over the following months. Marcus never asked me for money or favors, never pushed for more intimacy than I was comfortable with, and consistently demonstrated respect for my boundaries and independence. His courtship was a revelation after years of relationships based on obligation and financial dependence rather than mutual attraction and compatibility. We enjoyed weekend trips to art festivals and museums, quiet dinners at restaurants we chose, together, and long walks on the beach where we could talk without distractions. Marcus introduced me to classical music concerts and wine tastings, while I shared my growing knowledge of ceramics and gardening. Our relationship was built on genuine compatibility and shared interests, rather than financial need or family obligation. One evening, as we sat on my cottage porch watching the sunset, Marcus brought up a subject that had been on both our minds. "Margaret, I want you to know that I understand your situation with Ryan, and I admire how you've handled everything. I also want to assure you that I'm not looking for someone to take care of me financially or otherwise. I'm interested in a partnership between equals." His directness about the financial aspects of our relationship was exactly what I needed to hear. The transparency and respect he showed for my experiences helped me trust that his interest in me was genuine rather than opportunistic. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I'm still learning to believe that people can value me for who I am, rather than what I can provide." Marcus reached over and took my hand gently. "You have so much to offer beyond financial support, Margaret. Your strength, your creativity, your intelligence, your compassion. You're a remarkable woman who deserves to be cherished for all the right reasons." 12 months after Ryan and Sophia's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call that would test my resolve and emotional growth. Ryan's voice on the other end of the line was hesitant and subdued, lacking the entitlement and anger that had characterized our last conversation. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I have no right to call you, and I'll understand if you hang up on me. But I wanted to try to apologize and see if there's any possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship." The sound of his voice brought back a flood of memories from his childhood, when he had been a sweet, affectionate boy who brought me dandelion bouquets and handmade cards for Mother's Day. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull to comfort and forgive him, to overlook the pain he had caused in favor of restoring our family connection. "I'm listening," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral while I processed my own emotional reactions. Ryan's apology was longer and more detailed than I had expected. He acknowledged the extent of his criminal behavior, accepted responsibility for the pain he had caused, and described the therapy and counseling he had been attending as part of his probation requirements. He spoke about the dissolution of his marriage to Sophia, and his recognition that their relationship had been built on shared entitlement and manipulation rather than genuine love. "I realize now that I never learned to be financially responsible because you always rescued me from the consequences of my poor decisions," Ryan continued. "I blamed you for cutting off support when I should have been grateful for everything you had already given me. I understand now that pressing charges was probably the only way to force me to confront my behavior." His words suggested a level of self-awareness and accountability that gave me hope for his potential rehabilitation. But I had learned to be skeptical of apologies that might be motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse. "Ryan, I appreciate your apology, but I need to understand what you're hoping to accomplish with this conversation." There was a long pause before he responded. "I'm not asking for money or expecting you to fix my problems. I know I destroyed your trust and hurt you deeply. I guess I'm just hoping that someday, maybe years from now, we might be able to have some kind of relationship again. I miss having you in my life, Mom." The vulnerability in his voice was heartbreaking, but I had learned to protect myself from emotional manipulation, even when it might be genuine. "Ryan, I need time to think about what kind of relationship might be possible between us. Too much has happened for us to simply go back to the way things were before." We talked for another 20 minutes, with Ryan sharing updates about his life in recovery and his efforts to build a sustainable, honest lifestyle on his own income. He was working 2 part-time jobs while attending community college to develop new skills that might improve his employment prospects despite his criminal record. The picture he painted was of someone genuinely trying to rebuild his life through honest work rather than exploitation and manipulation. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my cottage living room, wrestling with conflicting emotions and desires. Part of me wanted to believe that Ryan had genuinely changed and that we could rebuild a healthy relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Another part of me remained skeptical that someone capable of such sustained deception and cruelty could change so fundamentally in just 1 year. I decided to discuss the situation with Marcus, who had become my closest confidant and advisor, on matters involving trust and relationships. His perspective as someone who had raised 3 children of his own and navigated complex family dynamics was valuable, and his emotional distance from my situation allowed him to offer objective insights. "What does your instinct tell you about his sincerity?" Marcus asked as we walked along the beach the following evening. I considered the question carefully before responding. Part of me wants to believe he's changed, but another part wonders if this is just a more sophisticated form of manipulation. He's learned that direct financial requests don't work with me anymore, so maybe he's trying emotional appeals instead. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It's possible that both things are true. He might be genuinely remorseful, while also hoping to eventually restore access to your support. The question is whether you're willing to risk finding out which motivation is stronger. His analysis helped me realize that rebuilding a relationship with Ryan didn't have to be an all-or-nothing decision. I could maintain strict boundaries while allowing for limited, supervised contact that would let me assess his sincerity over time without exposing myself to renewed exploitation. Over the following months, Ryan and I began a cautious process of reconnection that involved brief, infrequent phone calls and occasional meetings in public places. I made it clear from the beginning that financial support was permanently off the table and that any attempt to manipulate or pressure me would result in immediate termination of contact. To his credit, Ryan respected these boundaries and never asked for money or favors during our interactions. Instead, he focused on sharing updates about his progress in therapy, his educational goals, and his efforts to build an honest, self-sufficient lifestyle. Gradually, I began to see glimpses of the son I had raised, someone capable of growth and change even after making terrible mistakes. The process wasn't linear or easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt when Ryan's old patterns of entitlement or self-pity would surface during our conversations. However, his willingness to acknowledge these lapses and refocus on accountability suggested that his commitment to change might be genuine rather than performative. 2 years after the legal proceedings ended, I attended Ryan's graduation from community college, where he received an associate degree in computer networking. Seeing him walk across the stage in his cap and gown, having achieved this milestone, through his own hard work and determination, brought tears to my eyes. This was the first accomplishment of his adult life that he had earned without my financial support or intervention. After the ceremony, Ryan introduced me to his girlfriend, Jessica, a nursing student who seemed genuinely kind and down to earth. She was clearly aware of Ryan's past mistakes, but had chosen to support his efforts at rehabilitation rather than enabling destructive behavior. Their relationship appeared to be based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than financial dependence or social status. "I want you to know," Jessica said quietly when we had a moment alone, "that Ryan talks about you often and regrets the pain he caused. He's working hard to become someone worthy of your forgiveness, even if that forgiveness never comes." Her words suggested that Ryan's efforts at change were consistent and ongoing, rather than a temporary performance designed to manipulate my emotions. The fact that he had found a partner who supported his growth rather than enabling his worst impulses was encouraging for his long-term prospects. As my 3rd year of independence began, I reflected on the dramatic transformation my life had undergone since that humiliating moment at Sophia's bridal shower. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her ability to provide for others had learned to prioritize her own well-being and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. My relationship with Marcus had continued to deepen and strengthen, built on a foundation of shared interests, compatible values, and genuine affection. We had discussed the possibility of marriage, but had decided that our current arrangement provided all the benefits of partnership without the legal and financial complications that might arise from combining our assets and family obligations. The pottery skills I had developed had evolved from a casual hobby into a serious artistic pursuit. Several of my pieces had been accepted into local exhibitions, and I had even sold a few works to collectors who appreciated the unique glazing techniques I had developed. The creative fulfillment and recognition I received from this work provided a sense of accomplishment that was entirely my own. My financial situation had stabilized and improved beyond what I had thought possible during the darkest days of exploitation and fraud. The sale of my house, combined with the elimination of Ryan and Sophia's constant demands, had allowed me to rebuild my retirement savings and plan for a comfortable future based on my own resources and responsible financial management. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between family loyalty and financial exploitation. The boundaries I had established protected not only my own well-being, but also provided the structure that allowed Ryan to develop the skills and character he needed to build an honest, self-sufficient life. The journey from that moment of public humiliation at the bridal shower to my current life of independence and fulfillment had been painful and difficult, but it had also been transformative in ways I could never have imagined. I had discovered reservoirs of strength and resilience I didn't know I possessed, found my voice in demanding respect and accountability, and learned to value myself for qualities that went far beyond my ability to write checks and solve other people's problems. Standing in my cottage garden on a sunny Saturday morning, tending to the tomatoes and flowers I had planted purely for my own enjoyment, I felt a sense of peace and contentment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or gratitude. This was the life I had built for myself, based on my own choices and priorities, and it was exactly what I deserved. The sound of my phone ringing interrupted my gardening, and I smiled when I saw Marcus's name on the display. We had plans to attend a pottery exhibition together that afternoon, followed by dinner at a new restaurant we wanted to try. Simple pleasures shared with someone who valued my company for all the right reasons. As I headed inside to prepare for our date, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror and paused for a moment. The woman looking back at me had confidence in her eyes and strength in her posture that had been missing for years. She was someone who had learned to advocate for herself, set appropriate boundaries, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. That woman was exactly who I had always been meant to be, and it had only taken the worst betrayal of my life to help me find her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.